83-year-old Elena Davies sold every stick of furniture she owned. Her sofa, her kitchen table, the bed her husband gave her 50 years ago. All of it gone, $2,400. That was the price of keeping her grandson alive one more week. So she sat with him on the bare living room floor, his hospital bracelet catching the streetlight, her arms wrapped around his small body, and then a long black limousine pulled up to the curb, and a man in a coat that cost more than she'd earned in a year stepped out and started walking toward her door. He wasn't from the hospital. He wasn't from the bank. He was there because of something she'd done 37 years ago, something she'd buried so deep she thought nobody would ever find it. Elena Davies, a retired school custodian, sold everything she owned to keep her grandson alive one more week. The man at her door hadn't come about the bill. He'd been hunting for her since 1987, and the secret he carried could save the boy or destroy Elena completely. 2 weeks earlier, Elena Davies had received a letter from the billing office at County General. Her grandson Marcus, 8 years old and fighting end-stage renal failure, had been on dialysis for 11 months. The insurance covered most of it, but not all. A gap in coverage, a deductible that reset every January, a copay on every bag of fluid that cleaned his blood. The number printed at the bottom of that letter was $11,472, past due. The hospital was no longer willing to wait. If she couldn't pay at least $2,400 by Friday, Marcus would be discharged. And discharge for a child with no functioning kidneys who needed a machine to stay alive meant something Elena could not bring herself to say out loud. She called every assistance program the social worker had listed. She called her church. She even called the bank, her voice shaking, to ask about a loan against a house already mortgaged to its last beam. She had no savings. She had no credit cards. She had a pension check that covered the electric bill and the prescriptions and nothing else. On Thursday, with 24 hours left, Elena opened her front door to a man who advertised used furniture on a handwritten sign stapled to a telephone pole. She sold him her couch, her kitchen table with the 2 mismatched chairs, the dresser her late husband had built with his own hands, and the bed they had shared for 43 years. He gave her $2,400 in cash. She carried the money straight to the hospital business office, paid the minimum required to keep her grandson's name on the treatment schedule, and went home to a house with nothing left in it but a single lamp, a pile of blankets on the living room floor, and a boy who was still alive. That night, Elena sat with Marcus on the bare floorboards, his head resting against her shoulder, the hospital wristband still looped around his thin wrist. He was too weak to ask where the furniture had gone. She told him stories about his grandfather, about the house when it was full and loud, about how love didn't need chairs to sit in. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. The street outside was dark and quiet. Then headlights filled the window. A long black limousine, silent and impossibly out of place, eased to the curb and stopped directly in front of her house. The driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive coat stepped out, looked at the address on the mailbox, and walked straight toward her porch. Elena pulled Marcus closer. Her mind raced through every possible threat, every overdue notice, every worst fear an 83-year-old black woman alone with a sick child could conjure. The knock on the door was firm but not violent. She opened it a few inches, her body blocking the emptiness behind her. The man looked at her with an expression she could not read, part recognition, part something that looked almost like fear. Then he spoke, and the words shattered the night. "Mrs. Davies, my name is Raymond Keller. 37 years ago, you stole a vial of cyclosporine out of a locked hospital supply closet and injected it into a dying 10-year-old boy. That boy was me. I owe you my life. And right now, I'm the only person standing between you and a secret that could send you to prison." Elena didn't move. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, her body a barrier between this stranger and the boy asleep on the floor behind her. She hadn't heard that name in 37 years. Cyclosporine. She'd trained herself to forget it, buried it beneath decades of parent-teacher conferences and retirement checks and the quiet rhythm of raising a child who wasn't hers. But the word pulled it all back in an instant. The locked supply closet, the amber vial, the cold hallway at 2 in the morning, and the face of a 10-year-old boy in room 312, gray and dying, who wasn't supposed to live through the weekend. She stepped back and let Raymond Keller into her empty house. He stood in the middle of the bare living room, an incongruous figure in a coat worth more than this entire block, surrounded by blank walls and a single lamp and a pile of blankets on the floor. He looked at Marcus, at the hospital wristband, at the pale skin stretched over tiny bones. Then he looked at Alina and his composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes filled. The story he told her began in August of 1987. Raymond was 10 years old. He had received a kidney transplant 6 months earlier, a cadaveric match that had been nothing short of a miracle. But by late summer, his body was rejecting it. Acute cellular rejection, the doctors called it. His immune system was attacking the new kidney like an invader, and the only drug that could stop it was a medication so new most hospitals barely had it on formulary. Cyclosporine. County General had exactly 1 vial in the entire pharmacy. 1 dose. And the hospital board had already designated it for another patient, a 12-year-old girl named Jessica Morrow, the daughter of a state senator who had personally called the hospital administrator to ensure his child would be first in line. Raymond's parents had no such connections. His mother worked nights at a textile mill. His father had left years before Raymond could remember his face. They had insurance, but insurance didn't matter when the medicine didn't exist. The doctors told Raymond's mother to prepare for the worst. He overheard them from his hospital bed, their voices low but not low enough. He understood enough to know he was going to die. Alina Davies was not a nurse. She was a custodian on the night shift, the woman who mopped the floors and emptied the trash and scrubbed the blood off the walls of the emergency room when the violence of the streets spilled inside. She'd been a county general for 12 years by then, invisible to the doctors, invisible to the administrators, invisible to everyone except the patients who were awake in the dark when she came to clean their rooms. Raymond was one of those patients. He couldn't sleep. He was too scared. Alina would sit with him during her break, bring him extra jello from the cafeteria, tell him about her own son, a boy named David who was the same age and who had died of the exact same kidney disease 4 years earlier. She told Raymond she believed some people were put on this earth to save the children other people let fall through the cracks. She didn't tell him what she was planning to do. On the night of August 22nd, Alina used her custodial key to access the pharmacy supply closet at 2:14 in the morning. She knew the hospital's inventory system better than most of the nurses. She knew where the cyclosporine was kept, knew the dosage, knew how to draw it into a syringe, knew the IV protocol from years of watching and listening and memorizing everything the doctors did while pretending not to look. She took the vial. She walked into room 312. She hung the IV bag, connected the line, and pushed the drug into Raymond Keller's bloodstream while he slept. Then she went back to mopping floors. By morning, Raymond's fever had broken. His rejection markers began dropping. The doctors called it a spontaneous turnaround, a medical mystery, a miracle. Nobody questioned it because nobody wanted to. Nobody except the father of Jessica Morrow, who was told the hospital's only dose of cyclosporine had been lost due to an inventory error. Jessica died 48 hours later. Raymond paused here. His voice, which had been steady through most of the story, faltered. Alina watched his face and saw the weight of a truth he'd been carrying for decades. He'd learned all of this years later, after he'd grown up, after he'd built a career in pharmaceutical distribution, after he'd started digging into his own medical records to understand how he'd survived when so many others hadn't. He'd found the nurse's notes that didn't match the doctor's orders. He'd found the inventory log with a missing vial. He'd tracked down a retired pharmacist who remembered the incident and who told him, off the record, that a custodian had been suspected but never charged because the hospital was too afraid of the senator's wrath to admit the truth. And he'd found the name of the woman who had saved his life, Alina Davies, the same name on the birth certificate of the daughter she'd given up for adoption 2 months after the theft, a daughter who grew up knowing nothing about her mother's crime. Raymond had kept the secret for 14 years, ever since he'd uncovered it. He'd never contacted Alina. He told himself it was to protect her, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that the Morrow family had never stopped searching. Senator William Morrow had died in 1994, but his wife was still alive, and their surviving son, Jessica's younger brother, had grown up to become a federal prosecutor with a reputation for destroying anyone who got in his way. And now, through a chain of events Raymond hadn't yet explained, that son had learned Alina's name. He'd learned what she'd done, and he was coming. Alina lowered herself onto the bare floor beside her grandson, her old knees cracking against the hardwood. The lamp cast long shadows across the empty room. Marcus stirred, murmured something in his sleep, then settled, She pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders and looked up at Raymond, her face unreadable. "How long do I have?" she asked. "Before the prosecutor gets here." Raymond checked his watch. He'd driven straight from the airport, chartered a jet the moment he intercepted the grand jury subpoena that had Elena's name on it. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "maybe sooner." Stephen Morrow has a bench warrant signed by a federal judge. The charge is theft of a controlled substance from a federally funded hospital, which carries a 20-year maximum. But he's not just coming for you, he's coming for everything attached to you. Elena's hand found Marcus's thin wrist, her thumb pressing gently against his pulse point. She understood what Raymond meant. If she was arrested, Marcus would go into state custody. A sick child with end-stage renal failure shuttled into the foster system, his dialysis schedule disrupted, his transplant chances reduced to zero. She'd seen what happened to kids in the system who needed specialized medical care. They didn't survive. The charge against her wasn't just about a vial of cyclosporine taken 37 years ago. It was about what happened next. Jessica Morrow died. And a prosecutor who'd been 5 years old at the time had spent his entire adult life building a case that connected that death, that missing vial, to the woman who mopped the floors and disappeared into the night. But here is where the story takes a turn that even Raymond hadn't anticipated, because Stephen Morrow wasn't just seeking revenge. He had discovered something in the old hospital records that Raymond had missed, a document that changed the entire equation. And he had shared it with one other person, the one person who had the most to lose if the truth came out: Elena's daughter. 2 months after she injected cyclosporine into Raymond Keller, Elena gave birth to a baby girl at County General. She named her Grace. She held her for exactly 6 hours, memorized the curve of her cheek and the tiny perfect fingers, and then handed her to an adoption agency because she was 19 years old, unmarried, and barely earning enough to feed herself. She never told anyone the father's name. She never tried to find Grace. She told herself it was better that way, cleaner, that the child deserved a life unburdened by her mother's poverty and secrets. But secrets have a way of finding the light. And Stephen Morrow, with the full resources of the U.S. Attorney's Office behind him, had traced that adoption. Grace was now 36 years old. Her name was Grace Okonkwo. She was a pediatric nephrologist at the University of Chicago Medical Center, the same specialty that treated the same kidney disease that had killed Elena's son David, that had saved Raymond Keller, and that now threatened Marcus. And 2 days ago, Stephen Morrow sat down in her office and told her everything. Elena listened as Raymond recounted this. Her face remained composed, but her hands were trembling against the blanket. "Does she know about Marcus?" she asked. Raymond nodded. "She knows he's in renal failure. She's one of the top specialists in the state. She sees his name on the transplant waitlist every time she pulls up the registry. She's been watching his case for months without knowing he was related to her. And now Morrow wants her help." He paused, the weight of the next words heavy. "He's offering her a deal: testify against you, confirm the medical details of the theft, corroborate the timeline, and he'll make the criminal case against you airtight. In exchange, he'll pull strings to move her son up the transplant list." Elena's eyes cut to Marcus, then back to Raymond. "Grace has a son, a boy, 7 years old, also in renal failure, same genetic condition that runs in your family. She's been waiting for a donor match for 14 months. Elena closed her eyes. The symmetry was cruel. Her daughter, the infant she'd surrendered to give a better life, had grown into a doctor who spent every day fighting the same disease that was killing her own child and her unknown nephew. And now she was being asked to choose between a mother she'd never met and a son she might lose. Raymond waited. He'd prepared for many reactions from Elena: anger, despair, bitter laughter, but she simply opened her eyes and looked at him steadily. "What else did you find?" she asked. Because she'd seen the way he'd hesitated at the end, like there was more, and there was. When Morrow pulled your old personnel file, he found something else, a notation near the end of your employment record. You left County General in 1989, 2 years after the cyclosporine incident. The official reason was voluntary resignation, but the file had an addendum from the hospital's legal counsel, sealed and never disclosed. It stated that the hospital had conducted a quiet internal investigation into the missing vial and had identified you as the primary suspect. They didn't press charges because doing so would have exposed their own negligence, leaving a supply closet unlocked, failing to audit inventory, and the administrator's conflict of interest in prioritizing the senator's daughter over an indigent patient. They buried it. but Morrow has unburied it. And he's using it to argue that the statute of limitations doesn't apply because there was an ongoing conspiracy to conceal a crime involving a child's death. Raymond reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is a copy of the original case file from the hospital's insurer, the one that shows they knew, the one that proves they let you walk to protect themselves. And there's a name on it, a name that matters now. The attorney who signed off on the cover-up was a young associate at the hospital's outside law firm, a man who would later go on to become a federal judge, the same judge who signed Stephen Morrow's warrant, the same judge who will preside over your case. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a trap. Elena could not get a fair trial. The system was aligned against her from the bench down. And the only person who could stop it was a daughter who didn't know her, holding a grudge she'd been handed pre-assembled, faced with an impossible choice. Raymond pulled out a second document. "This is why I came tonight, not just to warn you, to show you that there's another way." He unfolded it. It was a donor compatibility report, fresh, dated that morning. The name at the top was Marcus Davies. The match was a living donor who had just been approved by the transplant board. The donor's name was Raymond Keller. He was a perfect match. He could give Marcus a kidney, and he wanted nothing in return except one thing: Elena's permission to take the stand and tell the world what she did, not as a crime, but as an act of courage that saved his life and made all of this possible. Elena stared at the paper. Her grandson, the boy she'd sold everything for, could live. But accepting the offer meant stepping into the light, facing a federal prosecutor who would use her confession against her, and forcing her daughter to decide whose child got to survive. The limousine was still idling at the curb. Somewhere in the night, a federal warrant was making its way across the city, and Elena Davies, 83 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of an empty house, had to answer the question that would define everything: how much was her life worth? And whose life was she willing to sacrifice to save it? Elena answered before the sun came up. She looked at the donor compatibility report, then at her grandson's face, peaceful in the last hour before dawn. "Take my blood," she told Raymond. "Take whatever you need, but I'm not hiding anymore. If that prosecutor wants to put an old woman in prison for saving a child, he can do it in front of God and everyone. I'll testify, and I'll make sure the world knows whose hands were dirty." Raymond made 2 calls. The first was to a criminal defense attorney who owed him a favor from a pharmaceutical patent case. The second was to a reporter at the Chicago Tribune who'd spent 3 decades covering the Morrow family's political machine. By 7 o'clock that morning, the story was no longer Stephen Morrow's to control. At 8:15, a black sedan pulled up behind the limousine. 2 federal marshals stepped out. They had the warrant. Stephen Morrow followed, a thin man in a gray suit, his face a mask of quiet fury. But before they reached the porch, Elena's attorney intercepted them in the front yard. She handed over a motion to recuse, citing the federal judge's direct involvement in the 1989 hospital cover-up. The document included the original sealed addendum with his signature, courtesy of Raymond's painstaking investigation. The marshals hesitated. Morrow read the motion, his jaw tight. The judge in question had already been contacted, and rather than face a judicial misconduct investigation, he'd recused himself within the hour. The warrant was voided pending reassignment. Elena stepped onto the porch, 83 years old, wearing a sweater her daughter would later recognize in photographs. She looked Stephen Morrow in the eye. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said. "I've carried her with me every day for 37 years, but I would do it again." Because the child in that bed had no senator for a father, he had nobody, and I was the only one who could save him. Morrow's face tightened. He had built his career on certainty, on the clarity of right and wrong, but standing in front of this woman, in front of the empty house and the sick child inside, and the billionaire who'd flown across the country to stand beside her, the moral arithmetic shifted. He didn't drop the case, but he didn't press it either. He turned, walked to his sedan, and drove away. By noon, Grace Okonkwo was at the door. She'd driven 6 hours from Chicago after a sleepless night. She had her son's medical file in her hand. She had a photograph of herself as an infant that the adoption agency had released to her years ago. And she had the same hands as Elena, long fingers, wide palms. She stood on the porch of the house where her mother had lived all these years without her, and for a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Marcus, awake now and confused, appeared in the doorway behind his grandmother, still groggy from sleep, his hospital bracelet catching the morning light. Grace looked at him, at this boy who had her mother's eyes, and something inside her shifted forever. 2 weeks later, the surgeries were scheduled. Raymond donated his kidney to Marcus at County General, the same hospital where he'd been saved as a child. The transplant took 7 hours. It went perfectly. But the second surgery, the one nobody saw coming, happened 4 days later. While Marcus was recovering, Elena sat in a room at the University of Chicago Medical Center and let a transplant surgeon run a final compatibility panel. She'd been tested years earlier for a hospital registry, and her file had flagged a match. Not for Marcus, for Grace's son, a 7-year-old boy named Elijah. The genetic markers aligned. She could donate. At 83, it was risky, but the transplant board reviewed her health and signed off. On the morning of the operation, Elena was wheeled into the OR, and for the first time in 37 years, she was about to give her granddaughter's son the same thing she'd given Raymond Keller, a chance to live. The surgery was a success. Both boys made full recoveries, and on a spring morning in April, 4 people sat in a furnished living room that no longer belonged to Elena alone. Raymond had bought back every piece of furniture she'd sold, down to the kitchen table with the 2 mismatched chairs. He'd also established a foundation in her name to cover medical debt for grandmother-headed households, seeded with $10 million. Grace sat beside her mother on the couch, holding her hand, while Marcus and Elijah played on the floor. And framed on the wall was a single piece of paper, not the hospital's donor report or the legal motion that saved Elena from prison, but a crayon drawing Marcus had made from his hospital bed. A stick figure of an old woman with big hands, holding 2 children, both alive. That drawing hangs in Elena's living room today, a crayon monument to a truth most of us learn too late. The people who hold the world together rarely make the headlines. Elena never sought recognition. She mopped floors, emptied bedpans, and sat with frightened children because she believed that if you have the power to save a life, you don't get to walk past. When the system told her a boy wasn't worth the medicine, she broke the rules. And when the system came for her 37 years later, she didn't run. She stood in the doorway of an empty house and dared it to do its worst. There are millions of grandmothers raising grandchildren in this country right now, many of them in poverty, many of them making impossible choices between food and medicine, between rent and treatment, between giving up and holding on. They are invisible. They are everywhere. And some of them are breaking rules right now, not because they want to, but because the rules were written by people who have never had to choose between saving a child and staying out of prison. If this story moved you, ask yourself, who in your life is giving everything and getting nothing back? Who are you walking past every day without seeing? And if you have a rare blood type, if you're healthy enough to donate an organ, if you have the means to relieve a family's medical debt, don't wait for permission. The system won't ask you. The people who need you will never know your name. But somewhere, in a hospital room you've never entered, a child is counting on a stranger who hasn't shown up yet. That stranger could be you. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the people who hold the world together in the dark. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that kindness doesn't require a title, just a willingness to act. And if you want to help families crushed by medical debt right now, I've left a link to the Undue Medical Debt Foundation in the description. Every $10 relieves $1,000 of debt for a family in crisis. Not charity, justice. The kind that starts with seeing people the world has trained you to ignore.